Good morning to one, good morning to all. It is Friday morning. Good morning to Dr. Maktes Azamande. Maktes, thanks for joining us again today, and good morning to you.
Morena.
Morena. You doing well? How's life in Christchurch at the moment?
It's good. Yeah, just work home pretty much.
Are you working from home because you're a lecturer at university? Are you working from home, or are you a student?
So when I don't teach, I'm mainly working from home, but for classroom instruction, I go in and then have a number of students in the class, and then 2/3 of them studying from home.
Are you? And I mean, I'm thinking about my years at university back in those days, being in lecture theatres. Those lecture theatres were like big bowls without like good ventilation or airing. The doors were behind us, and we were in these amphitheatres. Is your situation in a big theatre? Are you in a classroom? Can you have windows open for the whole,
I'm probably small.
Omicron stuff?
It's small size lecture theatres. I teach in very new buildings, so the ventilation is quite good, and like you can actually hear it. And the students I have to give a shout out to my students, really good with mask wearing and kind of spreading themselves across the lecture theatre, and just keeping a distance when they talk to me. So it's within the confines that we have, as safe as it can be. But of course we know it's, lots of people in one place, young people who have a social life after uni. There's always a certain amount of risk, but knock on wood, still holding strong, no symptoms. So
I'm happy to hear you. I'm actually going to bring up a story that I wasn't talking about doing at all, but I'm happy to hear you talk about your students sort of being sensible and good, because in Dunedin here yesterday, let me show this, St. Patrick's Day kicked in, and it didn't appear that the students in Dunedin were being sensible around St. Patrick's Day. There you go. There's an image of Omicron in Dunedin with the students. No distancing, whatever. No mask, no nothing. Hundreds of them gathering together. I guess, just setting up the next big spreader event. Yahoo!
I mean, I don't know what our students do when they're not in class, and because I live near the university, I don't see any of that. But I do want to say that, we're talking about young people, and we know what we were like when we were that age and the choices we make, and that we don't always make the most reasonable, maybe mature choices. So I don't want to excuse that behavior, but I think it requires some structural facilitation, because we know, particularly Dunedin is such a party school. I lived very close to Castle Street, and it was the first time in my life that I considered doing, an anthropological study of these subjects that were acting in ways I had never seen before. So I think Dunedin is quite unique, but I wouldn't say that young people being young people, it should surprise us. And if we want better measures, then we kind of have to create a bit more structure around that. But it's kind of...
How do you create structure around, 300 people going to a party in a backyard, which happened at the start of the Omicron wave? When you say structure around that, what do you mean? Give me an example of what you're talking about.
Well, I think so. Schools that have really good options for being online and on campus, I think that really helps. It gives people the choice of studying from home, and maybe making that decision of not going to campus, giving people alternatives of how they can gather. I think people always party in ways that is unsafe, whether that is Omicron unsafe or drinking unsafe or infrastructurally unsafe. I'm thinking about that balcony that crashed in Dunedin. If you give them safe venues to do that. So if we had places that gave people an outlet to come together safely, maybe then these self-organized, unregulated events happen less. I wouldn't say we can completely erase them, but I think it's, if you don't have a venue to go to get together in a safe manner, then of course you're going to start having your own party and hundreds of people show up, because it's really hard to control too. You might say, I'm just having a house party expecting 10 people, and then 50 show up, right? So I think it's I mean, people have written about, creating these no alcohol zones around the university, taking bars off campus kind of creates less safe avenues, and then people drink at home. There's like less safety around that. So I feel like this could be a similar situation, but again, I'm not a scientist, but I'm kind of thinking about other unsafe behaviors we know about, and I think it's about creating an alternative that would be more safe.
For people who don't know Dunedin, the one thing that's very different about Dunedin to other, like I went to university in Auckland and Polytechs and various things, the only city I studied in, so I didn't experience student life in Dunedin. But the thing that's very different about Dunedin is when people are drinking at home, the 7 homes on either side of them, the 7 across the road and all the way down the street are all students. It's like there's areas of Dunedin where that is the case. I sometimes drove through the Dunedin, the university area, to go from one part of Dunedin to the other, and the houses that the students live in are basically on the university campus. Like on the other side of the road is the university, and there's a whole bunch of university homes on the other side of the road. So, and then all those homes up that street are all students. So it's almost like Dunedin is set up for students in there. And I kind of look at it and going, why the fuck didn't I come to Dunedin? This would have been such a fun place to go to university, But I look at it and I think it's almost like they're an external dorm. Like you go to a dorm and it's all the students in the same building. In Dunedin, the dorm actually goes down the street amongst those 40 houses as well. And it's an area that if you do go and drink at home, you're still surrounded by, in every way you look, feel, and smell, let's be honest, as students as well. And that seems to be one of the differences. It's very easy to have a party take off in Dunedin because if your neighbors come and their neighbors come and their neighbors come and the neighbors on the other side come and the neighbors across, all of a sudden it's 100 students because that's all the neighbors.
Is couch burning still a thing? Because I remember when I was studying in Dunedin, on Friday morning, because party night is Thursday, you had to be really careful. You couldn't really wear like flip-flops or open shoes because there's so much broken glass on the street, and it would just be the remnants of a broken couch. And I know that kind of slowed down towards my final year, but it is something else. I think people think we're making it up. It really is something else. It's like the worst kind of like fraternity in some American college movie, but every Thursday.
As a student, the couch burning doesn't happen so much. I think probably what it's become, it's a bit like wearing a kilt when you get married. It's become a tradition, so it's pulled out on special occasions. The couch burning, maybe not quite the weekly event though, because it's part of the tradition. Pulled out on weekly, well, twice a year. Of course, in the old days, they used to do it at Carisbrook Stadium because there was concrete terraces. They'd bring couches into the Carisbrook Stadium. They'd watch the rugby, then they'd set them on fire. Madness. Hey, but this whole thing that we're talking about to do with a little bit of Omicron and what's going on, we're going to talk a bit about that today, based around the idea, and I'll say idea in case I'm wrong, but that the numbers we're seeing with Omicron at the moment seem to be at the top of the modeling that we got prior to Omicron, and certainly the top of the modeling that we've seen around the world. Why is that? So in conversation with people like Susie Wiles and others, Professor Michael Plant from the University of Canterbury has been suggested to come and have a chat with us, who is basically all about modeling. He's from the School of Mathematics and Statistics. But also the question was asked yesterday, why, if it is at the top end of the modeling, why? And again, I was in a text conversation with Susie Wiles, and she pointed towards the protests, that the modeling didn't account for the protests going on, and perhaps that's added to super spreader events and increased numbers. So the only really way to figure that out is to talk about genome sequencing and to figure out, are any of those protests, was the Wellington protest, as it contributed to the numbers massively around the country? On top of that, talking about those specific questions to do with, that's Dr. David Welch, by the way, who's been on before. He's from the School of Computer Science at the University of Auckland. He's coming on as well. But then on top of those kind of specific questions, I mean, I want to know a bit more about modeling and how it works and how it helps and how they do it, a bit more general, and also a bit more about what is genome sequencing. I mean, I think about genome sequencing as a bit of a detective case to tell us this is where it's come from, and it's from that area and that group of people, and it's gone. So we'll learn a bit more about that. But before David comes on, and let's actually, I'm going to say good morning to George because George is with us as well. Morning, George. Mike's off,
Good
brother.
morning. Yeah, there was couch burnings. In fact, Oscar Francis, a reporter at the ODT, said that he met a student that was concerned about the age of the couch because it was a very old couch, and he was worried that there was asbestos in the couch, and he was telling people to get away from it.
So they need, but that's actually, Omicron at the moment. If you're doing couch burning with asbestos, these are really good for that. So maybe there's a win-win there. Wear your mask to burn the couch as well, because George is a tutor at the University of Otago. So actually, we should have come straight to him to ask him that question. But it's not as common as it used to be, George. It's not a weekly event about
No, it doesn't. It doesn't seem to be as common. Yeah, speaking of students, like my students, they seem pretty good at keeping apart from each other and wearing their masks. What hit me the other day was just like how worse for wear the students that I tutor online seemed. They seemed very tired, and I couldn't, I couldn't bring myself to put them through 2 hours of journalism workshops. We cut it short because they looked tired. And, I'm also aware that like some of them had been physically in the workshops that I've been doing. So I have been in the vicinity of students with COVID, which also kind of scares me. But I guess you have to sort of just act as if everyone has it at the moment.
We're talking about some students, right? Like, I mean, I don't know, like when we say hundreds of students, there's thousands of other students who are not partaking. And I also feel for our students because most of my students work. They're doing work, they're doing study, they're navigating a pandemic, they're becoming adults. So, there's a lot going on. Like it's hard, I think, for us who supposedly got their lives figured out, and I say supposedly. So I think that's something that we also sometimes forget. It's really easy to point fingers at young people for supposedly bad choices, but bad choices that most of us would have made. It's and I think we're framing don't get together because people can get COVID a lot around physical health and somebody might die. But actually, there's so many other ripple effects. If 5 people in the same place get sick, then your class can't go ahead. So the first thing I said to my students is, hey, look, if I get sick, this goes online, and then we kind of lose an opportunity to interact with each other and have this little bit of sense of normalcy that remains. And I felt that was kind of more compelling to them than me saying, hey, like, we should make sure that nobody gets sick. Because I think for a lot of people, it's like, oh, I get sick, I get a little bit sick, what's the big deal? But it's the other repercussions, like, where's the impact felt the most? How does that disproportionately impact vulnerable communities?
Definitely, yeah.
Small businesses, like the kinds of people we actually do care about. So I feel like that I just try to find different ways of packaging the same message without it being, I don't know, I want to scare people. I feel like I want people to buy into collective care rather than, ooh, I'm going to scare you so you kind of do what I want to, but you don't really know why you're doing it. I don't really believe in that strategy.
I think you're right, Muktas, and George, thanks for jumping in for a little bit there. But that's exactly what I've been going through. I'm currently in isolation because of a housemate's choice to attend some events that were higher risk. And the thing I've been saying to my housemates, because I have boarders, is, just we're all trying to be careful here. You guys are adults. I don't want to control you. I can't control your own decisions. But if it comes into the house, these are the on-flow impacts. And we have counted, I think it's 15 or 17 people from us having to shut down, including I don't get to see my kids for a week. My kid's mother has to have the kids for a week longer, 2 workplaces. It's actually not I've tried to be doing this conversation about the health because we all know that statistically speaking, most people will be okay. We know that. But the flow-on effect to me and my business and, my other 2 people who live in this house and my kids and my ex-partner and their workplace, it's that flow-on that I've been trying to push a little bit as well to kind of go just
yeah, and the extra load on women, I think that people always forget that. I'm just like, especially for people with kids, like not all of us come with, living maids that can step up and do child raising chores and running a household and things like that. I think we really forget that when we are maybe like young single people, that the reality of everyone else is different. So I think those conversations I find more helpful. And also,
I agree.
I find the response is I get a more genuine, authentic, empathetic response, because it suddenly becomes about, okay, here are the 17 people and there's 17 names and you actually know all of them, and that's how it's going to impact us.
And that's only first generation people. And we've got Dr. David Welch, we'll chuck to you right now, but that's only the first generation, people who are directly impacted. Then there's one of my boarders who works as a lawnmower. What about all his customers? Then there's one of my people who I live with who works in a shop that's groceries. What about those people who are now not getting the same service? So there's a line of people that get impacted that are immediate. And then there are, I don't know, multiply by 3 the people beyond that who are also getting impacted. But look, this is exactly what we're talking about, and let's bring in to the conversation from the School of Computer Science at the University of Auckland, Dr. David Welch. David, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Oh, your microphone is a little bit crackly there. Just push the thing into your computer really well to make sure that it's connected well. Let's see how it goes.
It was working fine before when I tried it. How's that?
Probably be easier for you just to, I mean, if you're on a laptop and you have a computer, maybe just to pull it out and just go with the laptop microphone.
Yeah, I'm not on the laptop, but I can just change the mic I'm using. Okay.
Try now.
How does that sound?
Yeah, it's echoey, but it's much better. You're not all crackly and stuff. So let us go with that, sir. Thank you very much for joining. Really do appreciate your time, Dr. David Welch from University of Auckland School of Computer Science. David, we wanted to talk to you about 2 things today. The first thing we wanted, they're both connected to genome sequencing. We've had suggested to us that one of the reasons that it appears that we're towards the top numbers within the modeling that was given to us before the Omicron surge hit is because of the protests and the super spreader events that have been happening around the country. Now, that to me sounded like something that we should look into the genome sequencing and go, can we say that? Can we say that there are something in the genome that points towards specific areas or specific events that have contributed to the what appears to be higher numbers? But the second thing is we also kind of want to know about genome sequencing in and of itself, like to educate us as to what it actually is. So yeah, why don't we do that first of all? Can you give us a nutshell? What is genome sequencing? First of all, let's just start there.
Yeah, sure. So genome sequencing, it is, so people get tested for the presence of COVID, and that the swab that they take, when we're talking about PCR testing, the swab is processed in a lab, and the swabs that are found to be positive are sent on to a sequencing lab, which can basically decode the sequence, which is about 30,000 base pairs, so 30,000 DNA letters or RNA letters that vary a bit between different variants of the virus. So typically, if I infect somebody else, then those 30,000 letters will be almost exactly the same. There might be 1, possibly 2 differences, but over time, the differences build up, across chains of transmission, and we can, we can use that information to see who transmitted to who, how the virus is spreading around the country, that sort of thing. And also those mutations can affect how the virus behaves, right? So in terms of how it interacts with our body. The Omicron variant is different from the Delta variant, which was different from the original Wuhan strain. And so each of these has, somewhat different properties, and in terms of how fast they spread, the severity of the disease they cause, and that sort of thing. So our our efforts in genome sequencing, so we should pull back right from about a few months into the epidemic. We were trying to sequence every positive case in the country, and we carried that on until the kind of when the Delta outbreak started getting pretty large towards the end of last year, or late last year, and when our sequencing capacity couldn't quite keep up, but we were sequencing a good 20% of cases then. And since Omicron has hit and cases have just gone crazy, we're sequencing about 500 cases a week. So that's a small proportion of the cases out there, but it still gives us an idea of what variants are circulating, and whether any sort of interesting or important mutations are emerging locally.
Hey, David, your sound is average. I'll be honest. So what I'm going to do is ask you one quick question. It's fine because we can hear you okay. It's just a bit staticky. What I hear you saying is basically there's more data points to locate where that COVID cases come from. The closer you are to the original person, the closer those 30,000 data points are going to be to that person, so you can literally connect them. That's what I hear you saying. You can correct me when you jump back in now, but I guess to just quickly, only because the sound is not quite there. Is there anything that has been seen in the genome sequencing you're doing now, that is being done now, that points towards why these numbers appear to be at the top end of the modeling?
So there's no signal in particular events. So we see there were basically 3 major spreading events very early on that gave us distinct obvious different types that are spreading around the country, if you like, obvious different genotypes. But in the last month or two, we haven't seen any signal of a new major event. But there are 3 different strains of Omicron around: the BA1, BA1.1, and BA2. And we have most of our outbreak is now BA2, and that has a transmission advantage over the other variants of Omicron.
David, we're gonna. Oh, look, I'm really sorry. I don't mean to cut you short, but that sound is just it's bad enough that we are just going to need to leave it there. I really do apologize about cutting you a bit short there. Thank you for joining us in. And Marcus, I'm sorry for kind of not bringing you into that, but I just thought we should. The sound wasn't quite working, so we needed to really give David as quick and short a time as possible to get out the information. So what I heard him saying, just to recap, was genome sequencing is multiple data points up to 30,000, and that's how you can track them. That if you give it to your neighbor, you're closer to those 30,000 data points, which means you can track to where it's gone. And I was going to ask David what those 3 events were, but I'm sorry, the sound just didn't allow me to. But there were 3 events at the start that they can be tracked back to. So he didn't identify any one particular event, but it seems that they do see 3 events, 3 spreader events at the start of the surge that they can point to, but without identifying what those events were. Anything you want to mention, Marcus, before we move on to Professor Michael Planck? Sorry. We good?
Yeah.
All right. And again, I apologize about that sound team for who are watching, but it's live and it happens, and this is what we do. All right, well, let's look at the modeling then, and the questions around modeling and what is modeling, and also how the modeling is working for us in this current surge. We'll bring in to the show. I'm sure we're going to have fantastic quality sound for this one. Professor Michael Planck, University of Canterbury, School of Mathematics and Statistics. G'day, Michael. Thanks for joining us, man.
Kia ora.
Oh my God, that sounds amazing. Hey, Michael, I've already sort of set up and explained why we're having a chat with you and David previously, is that the current numbers appear to be near the top end of what was modeled prior to the surge. And we're wondering why that is, and what we see in the modeling, why it's happening. And so for you, I guess I was wondering, could you explain to us sort of, I mean, it's a bit of a, maybe it's a bit of a soft question, but what is modeling? But like how you do the modeling and how it helps us understand what's happening with Omicron and the particular modeling for the Omicron surge at the moment. What are we seeing in that today versus what was modeled?
Yeah, so I mean, when we do these models, we're really sort of trying to keep track of how many people are getting infected over time, and so we simulate how the virus transmits from person to person through the population. And what happens over time is that as more people have had the virus, it starts to get harder and harder for the virus to find new people to infect. And so that process, along with things like mask use and social distancing, eventually means that cases can no longer continue to go up, and that's when we hit a peak and numbers start to come back down again. I mean, in terms of the numbers being worse than what was originally predicted, I'm not sure that's really true. If you look at the modelling we did back in January before the outbreak started, we were saying that the peak hospital number could be anywhere between 800 and 3,000. Now that's obviously a very wide range, and at the time we were saying that we were optimistic that the numbers would come in towards the lower end of that range. We have to include the sort of the top end as a worst case scenario. But we felt with the booster rates we were seeing that we would come in towards the lower end of that range, and that's more or less where we seem to be tracking still now. The case numbers have been tricky to interpret, because when we changed to using rats, we got that sudden big jump, and so we were kind of working through a bit of a backlog. They've since stabilized. The numbers have stabilized since we moved to rats, and again, it's not inconsistent with the sort of peak case numbers we were expecting before the outbreak.
How do you include in the modeling? I was going to say, not meaning to be disrespectful to people, but sort of the idiot factor. I know of several people. Actually, one of the stories that I'm isolating because of a housemate, I know, not the housemate, but I know of a connection that's caused it to come into my house, where the people refused to rat and they refused to get tested, and they were, just playing it off. Is that such a small percent it doesn't impact the modeling, or is that something you have to think about?
Yeah, it is a small percent. I guess models don't really try and include that level of fine detail. What we work on averages. And so there'll be some people who are at this end of the scale who are going to infect more people. There'll be other people at the opposite end of the scale who are very, very cautious and don't pass the virus on at all, or pass it on to fewer people than the average. When you're talking about small numbers, those details do really matter. And so if you're modeling an outbreak where there's 10 or 20 or 50 cases, that's really difficult, because if you get someone who is very different from average, that can have a big impact on what happens. Once you start to reach the stage of an outbreak where you have thousands and tens of thousands of cases, looking at the average is more reasonable, because those sorts of fringe cases cancel each other out.
You're modeling and you're looking at Omicron right now. Are you modeling and predicting what's going to happen like later on this year already? Or do you need to know and understand, what a new variant or a new surge coming in needs to be? Do you have to model quite close to the event that's happening? Or are you already modeling what's happening in December? And if there is, can you tell us what's happening for Christmas, please?
So a bit of both, and models get used in a variety of different ways. So one use is in the short-term sort of projection, where we're really interested in what's going to happen in the next few weeks. When are we going to peak? How big is that peak going to be? How quickly are we going to come down off the peak? Those sorts of questions about what's happening in the next month or two. If we want to look further out, longer term, it is a lot more uncertain. We can't predict what a new variant will look like. We can say, what would happen if a variant that had these particular characteristics came along, and that might be interesting as a sort of a planning exercise. But we really can't predict the future that far ahead, because nobody knows what the next variant will be. Maybe it will be milder, but it's certainly not guaranteed. We could get a variant that's more severe or more transmissible, or that evades the immunity that we've built up to various extents. So yeah, unfortunately, I can't tell you what's going to happen next Christmas.
This, I mean, I didn't introduce us very well. This is Dr. Marcus Azamande as well. You guys actually are on the same campus at University of Canada.
All right. Good.
Yeah, different schools though.
Different schools. Is there anything you want to add in, Marcus, for this conversation around modeling?
No, it was really fascinating because I think it's good to know that we're working with average. I think sometimes people forget that these things they can take only some things into consideration and not everything, and they are, they're models. It's not like you reading the tea leaves and know exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, a model is not a crystal ball. It's a tool to help you understand what are some of the really important processes that are helping to drive what we see in terms of cases or in terms of hospitalizations, and how different actions might change that.
I also think it's good to point out that oftentimes this conversation is so focused on the ones whose actions maybe cause more risk, or whose actions we kind of want to expose. But I think it's really important that the average also includes people who are going above and beyond, and that can also contribute how the scenario for our future looks like. So it's not just about, what are the crazy few doing, but what are all of us doing that can also mitigate the other, I guess, like the other extremes that we can't control so well.
Is it the crazy few? I'm interested in that, Michael. Is it the crazy few? Are we seeing the people who are taking the risks and maybe not being? I mean, if there's a continuum of, lock yourself in a vault at one end and sort of licking the banister at the university at the other end of risk factor, in the modeling, where do we sit people? Is it like 2% extreme no care at the end and 2% extreme conservative? Is it an even bell curve, or are there more on the 2 years into it sort of not really caring, not taking risks side of it, and fewer on the taking more conservative choices? Do you know where that is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, what we've seen with COVID throughout the pandemic actually is that it's quite an uneven distribution in terms of the number of people that someone passes the virus onto. And, even with these more transmissible variants, it can be that actually the majority of people don't pass the virus on at all, or maybe pass it on to one other person. And so the outbreak is sustained by the small minority of people who do pass it on to more other people. And it's not necessarily that they've done anything bad or anything wrong. It's just the nature of differences in people's movements and contacts. You will have some people who are in a job where they're just interacting with a lot of people, whereas other people may be retired or for whatever reason don't go out or don't meet people as much, and those people are far less likely to pass the virus on. So there is a huge range, and that's been a feature of COVID and other infectious diseases as well in the past.
I guess the only question, and probably the most important question, Michael, based on your modeling, what you saw pre-surge and currently, have we seen the peak yet? When is the peak? And when are we going to be out of this this current surge, I mean?
Yeah, I think in terms of the national case numbers, I think we're pretty much at the peak or very close to it. We've seen that case numbers in the Auckland region have been dropping, and nationally, as I say, I think we're pretty close to that peak. Of course, cases is only telling you one thing. It's telling you about people who go out and get tested and upload their test result into the system. So there's still a question mark about what's actually happening in terms of the number of people who are getting infected with the virus. So the other key indicator to look at is hospitalizations. that lags behind cases by a week and a half. But we are seeing that is starting to flatten out as well, and hopefully we will see a peak in the national hospital numbers at some point in the next week or so. In terms of what happens after the peak, I think the numbers will probably come down slower than what they went up, particularly with the hospitalizations. We've seen a bit of a shift in terms of the age of people who are getting infected, starting off in the, being really highly concentrated in the young age groups, people in their teens and 20s. It's shifted a little bit over time into some of those older age groups, and hopefully that trend doesn't continue too much, but even that what we've seen so far will keep hospitalizations at a higher level for a bit longer going forward.
From the University of Canterbury, Professor Michael Plank. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate the information about what's happening now, but also learning a bit more about modelling in general. It's been great. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
And if at any point I did say Professor Michael Plant, I want to publicly apologise. That's my dyslexia kicking in. And I think it might have come out at the start, and I just want to apologise and say it's Professor Michael Plank. It's funny, I've got that, Muckers, I've got that thing in my head that, like, this show we're doing is called BHN. Every third time I upload it, I put BHW for some reason, and I just can't get it out of my head. And sometimes I send it out, the link's out, and it says BHW. I just cannot get it out of my head. And that's how my brain functions around my dyslexia. It gets in there and it stays.
It's okay.
It is okay. It is okay. Very much so.
I think we just need to be a little bit more generous.
Yeah.
With each other.
We are very excited, myself and George and anyone else that was here yesterday, to move into a conversation with you that I think is going to be the crux of you're going to be helping us out learn some things about it. But before we do that, we were going to start the show with this, and would definitely want to do this, and that's just acknowledge that there was a passing of a pretty important New Zealander yesterday. Sir Wera Gardner died last night. The news came out last night, age 78. This is just the report from One News. I think I want to play it just to acknowledge it, just to it's only 38 seconds, just to acknowledge the passing of an incredible human being in New Zealand and a great leader in New Zealand, let alone amongst Māori, but in the whole of New Zealand. So this is just a bit of an acknowledgement of this country being a bit of a lesser place today than it was yesterday when this man was here. Have a look.
Kia ora.
A respected leader in Māoridom, Sir Wera Gardner, has died. Tā Wera passed away in his home in Tairāwhiti yesterday after battling a lengthy illness. The founding director of the Waitangi Tribunal and the founding chief executive of the Māori Development Ministry, he had an extensive career in public service, playing pivotal roles in treaty settlements. Most recently, Tā Wera served as the interim chief executive of Oranga Tamariki, a role he stepped down from last year. For his contributions in services to Māori, he was made a Knight of the New Zealand Order of Merit in 2009. He was 78.
It's important that we acknowledge people, I think, always, and especially, important people. And maybe not everyone in the country knew of him and what he did, but, he was a massive leader, as I say, amongst Māori, but also just a leader in general. And so I wanted us to take a couple of minutes to make sure we acknowledge the passing of a great New Zealander. And as I said, we are a worse country today for not having him here than we were.
Okay.
So, Maktas, we want to have a bit of a chat about cultural appropriation versus, what did I write to you this morning? I wrote it out and I should read it.
Cultural appreciation.
Versus cultural appreciation versus emulation versus all sorts of other things that we are talking about in society today. Now, I have to say, I've had this conversation before, and I started it actually 12 months ago on St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick's Day being my day. People who don't know can't tell. I'm half Irish. My mother's grandparents were both straight out of Belfast, which means she was 100% Irish once removed, which means I am half Irish twice removed. That's my genealogy. So, and my mum was Irish. I mean, she was born in New Zealand, but it was you went back to Ireland and everything made sense and fitted in. So it's a part of who I am and what I am. I had this realization 12 months ago, driving through North Dunedin, funnily enough, and the students, and seeing a whole bunch of students dressed in green, getting shit-faced on St. Patrick's Day, celebrating, quote unquote, St. Patrick's Day. And I just had the thought, I'm like, if it was a different patron saint's day and these students were dressed in different garb, I wonder how that would be accepted within society. And it wasn't me kind of going, don't you do that with my culture. It was me just kind of pondering out loud, what if they were dressed in a different religious day's garb, getting shit-faced and drinking to celebrate it? How would that be accepted versus how do we all kind of love going out for a Guinness on St. Patrick's Day? And that's where kind of the conversation started for me. And we were going to talk about this yesterday, but we actually ran out of time. And Muktas, because you were coming on today, and as I've described you before, you sort of have a PhD in racism, and you're going to be the perfect person to talk to this about as well. So let me set this up by saying, purely by chance, South Park yesterday, the episode that came out yesterday, brand spanking new, talked exactly about this. I'll play a little clip here, and you'll see about them South Park are geniuses. They make fun of stuff which is actually, it's a double entendre, points back 3 levels. What they're not actually talking about is what's he talking. So just to set it up, this is not what I'm talking about. This is what South Park did yesterday.
And a fine St. Patrick's Day to all of you. I don't know if you noticed, but there's a farm across the street selling weed also. And the owner is actually 10% Irish.
So obviously you're upset that you don't seem to have any customers.
What I'm upset about is a wee little thing called cultural appropriation. Ever heard of it? That's why we can't wear sombreros on Cinco de Mayo. Why we can't dress like Indians on Halloween.
What's your point?
I'm looking at my point, you racist son of a bitch.
They go on. As South Park does, they are offensive and make their points, but that's what it is. So I don't know how to really start this, to be honest with you, Muktas. I think I've set up the idea of what is cultural appropriation. I have examples up the wazoo of, Asian boba tea stores in New York being accused of cultural appropriation because they're selling black tea. Speaking of the Irish thing, I've got examples of an amazing Irish dancer. I'll put that on, bring it back up. Who is African American, and she's been accused of cultural appropriation because she's not Irish. And she's amazing. She's like one of the best in her field, in her country, sort of thing. And what I'm wanting to do is I'm wanting to understand and learn, because I think we're in a transition in society right now where we're not rewriting rules, but we're kind of fleshing them out and trying to figure out what all these sorts of things are and how they relate to our daily lives. So how about I just shut up and sit back and give the floor to you to see what you want to say.
Yes, I'm not. So my examples might not be so much focused on St. Patrick's Day, but I'll start off with, I think there's a difference between talking about a cultural appropriation as a critique of behaviors that kind of reinforce already existing power structures. So things that might produce a demonization of cultures, or create a caricature of cultures, or appropriate ideas for the benefit of others, right? So I think there's always the critique is one thing. And then there's the other thing is, how does that critique get picked up in the everyday and people use it? Those overlap, but they aren't identical. So I think, yes, there might be some people who might look at an I don't know if this person was African American or if it's the black dancer as doing cultural appropriation. But we can't conflate that one critique with that one example is the essence of what people are trying to do with cultural appropriation. So usually cultural appropriation talks about how dominant groups, dominant cultural practices pick up symbols, practices, ideas of minority groups that decontextualize them, essentialize these groups, and also create benefit for the ones who are using them. So one really, really common example of that is the fashion industry, how haute couture houses, these mega brands, will steal patterns from indigenous women in, let's say, Central America, put them on the runway, make billions of dollars without accrediting where that pattern has come from, while these communities are, living in poverty and not getting recognized that that those same patterns or embroidery has actual cultural significance to people. So the critique is you're completely emptying this cultural practice, this embroidery or whatever, this pattern, design, whatever it is that we're looking at, of its original meaning. And then the other critique is you're actually benefiting from something that isn't yours. So I think that's very different from, oh, somebody went to, let's say, Guatemala and picked up a shirt with embroidery that they bought from a local, artist. And then that same shirt travels to New York and is worn by somebody. So I think that is one of the ways in which we need to understand where cultural appropriation is coming from. It's not nobody should ever wear anything that belongs to another group. It's about, how is that picked up? Another example would be, I think we can see that in the wellness sector as well, how yoga over time has been completely detached from where it's originally come from and to the benefit of a completely different demographic sector, right? Like the people who make money are not necessarily the people where the practices come from. And it's left the people outside, right? So people who are obsessed with turmeric tea love the tea, but they don't love, the sub-Indian, like the Indian subcontinent where that tea may come from. So I think it's kind of highlighting, you can say that you love and appreciate something if you actually hate its people that it's attached to, or you only love it if it creates benefit for you. Now with St. Patrick's Day, I think it is a little bit, there's a complexity to St. Patrick's Day because it is something that I think started by Irish minority groups, but it is so inherently tied to how St. Patrick's Day developed in the United States, and then how the version of St. Patrick's Day, how it happens in the United States, got globalized, right? So I don't think it is just a diasporic Irish thing. It is very much a diasporic Irish practice in the United States, and then how it evolved in the United States and then was exported everywhere else. I've got a lot of Irish friends who have the same unease, I think, when they see what that looks like. St. Patrick's Day isn't really a thing in Germany. Like there's some people who go to an Irish pub on that day, but when I was growing up, it wasn't really something visible. So I was quite surprised when I came here how tight people were to it. But again, it kind of creates this really flattened image of what Irishness is. But now we can also talk about how Irish people over time have gone from being a really marginalized group to kind of having made it into being included into the mainstream, which kind of also, I think, shifts the dynamic of how this power imbalance needs to be considered, right? So I think I personally don't really hold on to like percentages and authentic versions of Irish people, because there's people in Ireland who look like me, and who might express their Irishness in very different ways, or people like me who might think that Germanness is about bratwurst and beer and Oktoberfest, and I've never been to the Oktoberfest. Doesn't make me in any way less authentic, So I think that it is a bit more complex, but people who point out cultural appropriation as a systemic issue are pointing out how cultural appropriation sometimes is an extension of a benign way in which we perpetrate racism.
It sounds like one of the things you're saying, and look at me, I'm at school taking notes as you're writing away there. It sounds like, if I can hear what you're saying, like, so for example, you mentioned if the cultural appropriation, you use the example of fashion, if it benefits the one who are using them, and that I think that's really easy to see if you have, like you say, a fashion line. What about when I don't actually want to get into examples, because it sounds like what you're saying is, if I can say, pure actual technical accurate cultural appropriation is a lot bigger than screaming at the person selling black tea. Maybe even, although it's really weird, Muktas, and I don't know how much of my kind of racist history I'm going to reveal by saying things like this, but like, I'm uncomfortable at the moment using descriptors that other people use accurately, like the term, when we're referring to someone who's African American in America as black, is a term that is used widely and accurately, and there's no connotations to it. I feel uncomfortable describing someone as black, because I think aren't they more than that? Like, I was thinking about something today, and those sorts of starting to use terms where you put people into these descriptors that some then think, oh well, that means because you're racially sort of profiling them or that kind of stuff. And I guess maybe this is a conversation just for me trying to work all this out and work out what it is, because when you talk about benefits the ones who are using them, that says to me straight away, well, the person wearing the Native American headdress, they're just wearing it. That's fine then. But then again, that's the example we get in the media of the worst kind of cultural appropriation. So is it that the media is blowing up stories that aren't necessarily the context of what cultural appropriation is, or is it that it is deeper than just getting a financial benefit from it? There's other things as well.
I mean, it is that is also an example of cultural appropriation. So the person selling the headdress and the person picking up the headdress and wearing it as costume are both, like, I think they're part of the same problem, right? I think that there's I think sometimes in Western countries we think everything is up for grabs and everything can be turned into a commodity, and I think we should have conversations over, is everything up for grabs? Is anything taboo? So I don't think that people who want to talk about cultural appropriation are driven about, oh, there are things that can be said and there are things that can never be said. There are things that can be worn and there's things that can't ever be worn. I think people want to highlight how sometimes really benign actions are reproductions of systematic inequality. Like the fact that we think that something that is sacred to First Nations people can be costume that we wear to a festival.
Yeah.
Right? Or that these practices are somehow in the past because the people who were attached to them are all dead and exterminated. So these actions on an individual level help to maintain these myths about people as inferior, people as, gimmicks to and it also kind of reproduces that we as, and I say we as like a, like a collective how we maintain people in a position of being dominated because we are the ones who dictate the narrative. So one way power works is that those who have it get to define what is and isn't a problem, what isn't acceptable. And the moment people resist that, what they're trying to do is they're trying to shift the power. Okay, so I do think that, yes, people who are making money robbing and claiming things that isn't theirs is the problem, but also what narratives are reproduced in our actions. And again, like as systemic inequality is systemic, we can internalize it, it can show up interpersonally, it can show up in our groups, but it also shows up institutionally. So for me, when we say, hey, maybe don't dress up as an ethnic group for Halloween, that is a critique of that person, that is a critique of the people selling these costumes, but it's also an invitation to a broader conversation. Why do we think certain people are gimmicks for us to use, right? And why can't we hear them?
Can I just jump in? Because I know you've said it's kind of contextualized based around the sort of American version of St. Patrick's Day, but that does bring me straight back to that idea of people dressing up as Irish sort of thing. I mean, it doesn't feel as sensitive because it's not necessarily the sacred garb, right? I get that, but it's still, it still has an element of that dressing up and to identify from that nation. But what I wanted to ask you, and this is maybe a overly blunt question, is how much of this is just about whiteness versus non-whiteness? Because I'm a very let me explain. I'm a very good mimic, right? I'm good at doing accents. I can do dozens of accents. I do it quite well. I've done it for a long time. Me doing an accent of a culture like Scottish or American or, let's say a predominant Caucasian culture, no one would have a problem with that. Me doing an accent of an Asian or a Indian or a predominantly non-Caucasian culture, people are like, oh yeah, it's I don't know, I'm not sure about that. Now I'm not part of that American culture, or I'm not part of that Scottish culture or that South African culture, but they are predominantly Caucasian and I'm Caucasian. Equally, I'm not part of the Indian culture or the or Asian Japanese culture or whatever. So I don't know if that's a terrible question to ask.
Okay. So if you're using something and you make an accent to piss at power, I think it's okay. If you're making that accent to kick down to people who are disempowered, that's being a bully. So I think that's a difference between bullying and satire. Like satire pisses at power. you know, and bullying is when you kick down at people who have less power than you. And I think that's how I would make that differentiation.
Right.
I imitate the accent of my parents all the time. You know, but I think if we're doing it in a way that demeans, or if we're doing it in a way that uplifts, I think there's a difference. People can do a really good accent. I mean, I would love to be able to do a good Scottish accent. I do think, okay, so I think, has it something to do with whiteness? I use the word whiteness because I'll send you a different link. Like Caucasian has also like a very interesting history as a term.
Whiteness is
yeah, it has. I think it has something to do with that, because we think this is a group that has kind of been included into whiteness. I think that's really important to say, that the Irish in particular have been a group that have kind of over time been included in that collective. I do think people point that out about St. Patrick's Day as well, that it is mocking, and it reduces, you know, Irish people to binge drinking. So I do think that a lot of those
drinking
are there
Irishman.
too. You know, I think that it's important for us to do, like, to have those conversations openly. I just don't like when some niche Twitter fight becomes the representation of what the critique is. And sometimes we think what happens on Twitter is what's actually happening in real life, just because it seems so loud.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, is the consequence the same for someone who's yelled at by even 500, 5,000, 500,000 people on Twitter, than if there's actual real life consequences? So I think sometimes the screaming on social media is taken as evidence for people are not allowed to express themselves, which I think isn't quite accurate. I always want to keep the conversation about cultural appropriation tied to what it should be tied to: conversations about colonization, conversations around, you know, racism and racist practice. So I think that's a really good one. And I think within that, there's space to talk about the representation of St. Patrick's Day, that so many people so happily participate in, you know? So I find it quite strange how, I guess, a big commercial day, like, it's commercially driven that way, because people sell all sorts of merchandise and give people an excuse to be drunk during the day. So I think maybe the conversation around commodification is an important one to have, you know, like the critique of the way things get commodified.
This conversation, I could probably have you for the next 2 hours. I mean, we've done 2 podcasts before, and it's sort of the conversations we have had and those big, long conversations. But I want to ask one more question based on the back of this. And I want to bring George in as well, because I can see him in the background nodding away. And so I'm sure he's got some stuff to add. But the last thing is, we're talking about appropriation, emulation, appreciation culturally. I mean, culturalness, I guess race, is a protected class. What about this flowing on into other protected classes? And we're having conversations at the moment, for example, and not to belabor the point, but, you know, Lin-Manuel Miranda set up In the Heights movie and got criticized for not using the correct Latinos in that representation. So, but that's a make-believe movie, but then it's okay for, I don't know, a lesbian woman to play a straight woman, which you could argue is a protected class as well, going across from one to the other. Or, you know, a young person playing an older person. Why aren't they saying, well, if you're going to play an older person in a movie, you must have an older person to play that movie? And I don't know whether it's same or similar, but I feel like at the moment, and maybe this is me, maybe I'm wrong, but in society, we're having these conversations, and there's a lot of things to figure out to make it work in society. Because if it's not okay in one aspect of a protected class, then one could argue that what if they do exactly the same in a different protected class and it's fine? Or are there different levels of acceptance for different protected classes, and is that just how it is?
So I always refrain from doing using relativism, because otherwise we don't talk about where the problem is. So for me, if we're talking about an underserved, under-resourced, underrepresented, exploited category that seeks to access representation, resources, and potentially a shift in the power, then that's very different than people who have historically enjoyed access, resources, and power doing the same. right? So if we say, oh, here's a straight actress playing a trans character, we're talking about a category of people who have very easily have access to all sorts of roles. And then we're talking about a subject position that historically hasn't had that same representation, access, and power. So I think that's really what it comes to. It's not, oh, Mahdis can only talk about issues that impact German Iranians of a particular class background who were born in the 1980s, right? It's not about that. And I think we need to be really, really careful to not make it that. And I'm not saying that that is only done by the people who don't like these conversations. That's sometimes also done by the people who are kind of thinking that they're fighting for these conversations. I think the struggle is good. That's how social change happens. Social change happens also with backlash and tension, and pointing out that something is good, but it could have been done better is not inherently a rejection. And it just shows that, you know, we're works in progress, and it's okay to be held accountable. Maybe we can have a conversation over what are the best ways to create systems of accountability.
Yeah.
You know, so I think, and that's just a personal note, I think calling out has some value. I do it occasionally for some things, but I'm really working on myself to create a culture of calling people in. Not with Nazis. Have no desire to call in a Nazi. I should say, like, there are limits to who you call in. But I think that's a different conversation. Are we having a conversation about, oh, I don't like your accountability mechanism? Or are we having a conversation, oh, I don't like you telling me that I was racist? Because that's completely different. You know? So I think sometimes those get muddled. And also we don't have enough space to actually sit with our discomfort and just talk safely. Like, I love my class for that. I'm like, in my class, no stupid questions, no, everything is allowed. Like, literally everything is allowed. And as society, we think, oh, I'll use my platform with 5 million followers. Oh, sorry, I was just practicing. It's like, fuck, man, like, no. Sorry, my mother was like, am I supposed to curse or not? You know, I think time and place, find your safe people who can help you. But accountability also requires like radical humility, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. And look, before George jumps in, let me just say as well, you've just said what your beliefs are. I guess my beliefs or my idea behind these questions and this journey that I'm on is I don't want to hurt people, or, you know, I don't want to, you know, I'm very much I will happily follow along the rules of society which create the most equitable place that most people are going to feel a certain, you know, safe and happy and healthy. And it just seems at the moment we're in the middle of what that conversation is. And, you know, I like what you said about Twitter, and love him or hate him. And I'm sure there'll be lots of people who watch this who hate Dave Chappelle, but or dislike his comedy. He said this one thing once about Twitter. He goes, you know, Twitter went crazy about me and piled on. He goes, I don't give a fuck, because Twitter's not the real place. So I'm like, I like that idea of you know, what giving Twitter the validity it does have as a tool of communication, but not actually necessarily being representative of what the world thinks and is as well.
I mean, if the entire Twitter was saying that you did something wrong, I do feel like sometimes we should take that hint in terms of Dave Chappelle.
But I don't think that ever happens. I mean, has it ever happened?
I feel like people gave him that hint kindly and not so kindly, collectively, personally. And whether or not he chose to engage with that hint is up to him. But yeah, I do agree. I do agree that we need to sometimes differentiate between what happens in the online space and what happens in real life. Because I think sometimes people take really loud screaming online as if there was a real life consequence for someone. So I'm thinking about, you know, people who commonly engage in like sexual misconduct, and then there's this outcry and everything is like everything is plastered everywhere online. But that doesn't actually really often result into some, you know, changes in the system, structures being adapted, or real life accountability for that person. So I think we need to be really cautious. And just because it's loud online, what do we want? Do we want it to be loud online, or do we want to create change in society? And I think, and those overlap. I don't want to say that they're completely separate spaces. I don't want to say that at all. Yeah, so that's what I mean. Like, I don't want to take some niche conversations and say this very, like, these 5 people are the ones who are defining cultural appropriation. I'm like, nah, this is a much bigger debate.
We're over past midday. We should almost wrap around midday. But George, I know that you want to add something in here, George. So the floor is yours, sir.
Oh, I really appreciate the conversation. It's interesting. Often people misunderstand, like, being critical of appropriation or even just discussing what it is and isn't. And people will suddenly think that we're making up rules of what they can and can't do, right? Whereas really what we're trying to do, and I think what we should do, and this is the academic in me, is reconceptualize or question what culture is in the first place. And that it's not this sort of, culture has increasingly been seen as, and this was mentioned, as a sort of commodity that one owns, right? And that is sold and bought, and that has some sort of essence to it, that there is a Scottish culture or a whatever culture that can be, exchanged in a market or whatever. But really what we should do is sort of question these assumptions about what culture is in the first place. And I think from there, and with obviously, plugging in the sort of dimension of power that was discussed today as well. And as well, I think that's probably an important dimension here as well, is obviously that it is often a vehicle for power at the same time. But yeah, really, I think really the answer is another question as per usual. So what is culture? Yeah, that's my thoughts anyway.
Yeah. I think I love these conversations, and although this is one that I find a little bit it's a bit awkward. I mean, it's not awkward, but it's like it's a sensitive conversation. But I mean, the heart of this always for me is to learn and to figure it out and to go, how do we traverse?
Exactly.
I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I'm thinking about transformative change. Like, and I'm thinking about what can we do. Oh, back on your mat. Go on. I think about I want to add to the public discourse and help myself and others kind of figure this out. And it's a little bit like, I'm a huge believer in you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. I love leading horses to water, and I love being led to water. And then it's the choice whether that horse chooses to take the drink or not. But I love thinking about the idea of what I do, what we're doing right now, George and Maktes, is we can lead a horse to water. And maybe this journey to this water hole is 1 kilometer long, and we've just taken the first 200 meters. So maybe there's a long way to go on this journey before we get to the water for people to drink. Or maybe there's little sips along the way. I don't know. But it's always the genesis of what I'm trying to do is, like, figure out answers, ask questions, and learn. And that's what hopefully we're doing today.
And I think we're also modeling different ways of having a conversation. So I think sometimes sitting with somebody who feels like this is awkward, I'm this uncomfortable, and somebody who's like, "Oh, I've had this conversation many times," is about modeling what else is possible. This doesn't have to be the only way to have this conversation. This doesn't even have to be the best way to have this conversation. We're just adding one more option of, hey, people, we're having this conversation. This is what it looked like. We're trying to do it in a way that's dignified and kind of keeps our relationships intact and is transformative. And then if I see some other way of having a conversation, I could be like, oh wow, okay, I should try that. I think for me it's about just putting different ways of engaging out there, so that we're not constantly told that this really narrow either or, we can't have critical conversations and disagree. And there needs to be a space for all of that. And there also needs to be, I think there needs to be a space for calling people out as well.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Alrighty, team. Dr. Maktes Azamande, George, Elliot with us as well. I think we're probably done for today. What do you think?
Yeah.
We're probably done. This has been fun. I apologize if you've watched the whole episode about the audio with David Welch. We can't control that. These things happen sometimes. No big deal. We'll get David on another time to talk a bit more about genome sequencing and that. George, thanks for all your work behind the scenes, as always, as per usual. Thanks for your insights on camera as well. And Maktes, thanks for co-hosting today. And look, we love having you on as co-host, because not only are you a co-host with interesting questions and opinions and insights, but you're also an expert in your field, like we've just talked about for basically half an hour, to do with areas that, I think are really interesting and important conversations to be having today. So thank you.
Kia ora, thank you.
All right, team. We will now, George. It's Otago anniversary on Monday, but we're coming back for that. We don't get days off in this thing we're doing. Is that right?
It's just a regional holiday, so the news
right.
continues.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us.
See you Monday.
We will see you back Monday morning from 11 a.m. for another BHN. Sometimes it's BHW, but today it's BHN. All right, team. See you later.
Yep.
Bye.